Hello, everyone. This is part 3 in our 3-part series on planning, instruction, and assessment. I said I'd keep these short. I promised to do that today. We're going to talk about assessment, just to kind of give you a few things about this video. One, this is about the 10th time I've tried it, so I've made it up here. I've established I'm pushing through. So we'll see how that goes. Could be a mess. But with all that being said, in all seriousness, we're going to look at it. I was reading a lot of articles this week about assessment, just kind of thinking about what we're going to do with this video and something I could do quick. And I'm not going to do something where I tell you a bunch of different assignments that you can do for assessment. One, you'll get a lot of that in your methodology classes. That's your 585s for most of you. They'll give you ideas that you can work with within your content area. What I'm going to kind of focus on is more things to think about with assessment. So one of the articles I kept coming back to has 6 tips. I like what she's saying in a lot of this article. So she has nice, bold print for each one. So I'm just going to look at that bold print and kind of give you my viewpoints on it. Some of it delves a little bit off of what she says, but I'm going to post the article up and you're welcome to read it if you'd like. Just a quick refresh though, in case I use these terms, don't forget there are two types of assessment. There's formative and there's summative. Just to kind of give you a broad overview definition again, formatives are those low stakes you're checking for understanding as you're teaching. Summatives usually have a little higher stakes and they're actually assessing what you really want your students to know. A lot of times, I guess the most traditional ones would be a unit test or something like that, major project. But formative, you're checking where students are within a lesson. You're measuring what they know. And summative is that high stakes, cumulative type assessment. So with that being said, we're not going to get into that too much. I'm going to share my screen here. And hopefully something's going to pop up here that says 6 tips for creating powerful assessment for your classroom students. I'm sorry, I'm going to reread that because I added a word. 6 tips for creating powerful assessments for your students. I'm just going to run down each one of these, like I say, and I think there's good tips in here. I'm going to give you my viewpoint and I will post this up on Sakai. This is a big one. Begin with the end in mind. There's a couple ways you can interpret this. She has her own spin, like I say, on this, but I do think this is important. When you're creating your assessment, make sure that you are actually assessing things that you feel are important and align back to your objectives and your standards. That's the most important thing. And I hate to say this word, but since it was big news last week, at TPA, that is a very important thing. Make sure everything can be mapped back to your objectives and your standards. You want to know, sometimes I think what she's saying in this article, and it's not a bad thing, create your assessment and then you kind of know what you want students to know, and then you can work back on your objectives and your standards or rework both. So begin with the end in mind. It's backwards planning. Some people do not like that, but it is something that a lot of people do, especially related to assessment. I guess I'll just say this because I think what a lot of people worry about with beginning with the end in mind, sometimes people feel like it's teaching to the test. I don't know if it's always that, especially if you're making your own assessments. You just need to make sure the assessments are strong and actually when you create them that they just connect to what you want them to learn. But that's neither here nor there. Make sure everything aligns. Communicate your purpose. This sounds very simple, but students need to know what you want in an assessment, especially if it's not just a test. I'm sure you've been in a class where someone hands out something and there's not a lot of directions given. Think about that when you're creating an assessment. You need to take a few moments and explain to your students what you want from them with assessments. You need to talk to them. If you have a rubric, I always think it's a very good idea to go over the rubric with them. And if it's something that's a little more vague or open-ended, they're going to ask they're going to want to ask questions as to what you want. Sometimes your answers, especially with things that are more open-ended, are going to be a little more vague. So be prepared just to have responses. I'll give you an example. If I had an essay, students would always ask me, how long does it need to be? Well, my response was always, it needs to be long enough to answer the question posed, but you need to make sure you give me some examples, and whatever you know, write it down. Um, I'm a more is better type thing. That was my answer. I am not saying that you have to use that. You're welcome to rip it off though. The next one, actually going to find this kind of goes into the next three, I believe, but blend assessments into your teaching. You need to, and this is where your formative type stuff comes in. You should be doing information checks as you're teaching. You shouldn't just per se, like we've talked about with the instructional things in the class and on the instructional video, don't just lecture straight through and then give an assessment. There should be points within that you're doing assessment. I like Nearpod because you can do it. I know some of you have used it. It's a good way just to check for understanding. But there's other ways to do it. You can just simply ask questions. You can have little information checks go in there. Maybe you're talking in a class and you give an exit ticket at the end. I got to see a lot of you in the classroom before all this happened, and I thought a lot of you were really good about that. But that's, these informational styles of checks. Avoid bias in your assessment. I like how she states this. Again, I'm not going to read it word for word, but one thing that I like that she was making a point, she's not talking about bias just in like blind grading where you would have every student has a number and you grade it so you're not showing favoritism. I mean, that's obviously important. What she's talking about a good bit with this identity and avoid bias. Your students all have strengths. We talked about these back in February, I believe, with Gardner. We all have different ways that we kind of learn, or at least our brain seems to gravitate to. So when you make your assessments, keep that in mind. Maybe sometimes tests are a good thing. Maybe sometimes written answers are a good thing, short answer. Maybe sometimes it can be a little more artistic. Maybe they're composing a song. Maybe they're creating a court case. Maybe they're doing a court case. Maybe they're doing simulations. What I'm getting at here is you need to mix it up. And that kind of goes right in with number 5 there, where consider non-traditional assessments. As you get more tools in your toolbox, especially down the road, it's very easy when you first start teaching. You're probably going to use some of the more traditional things like tests and exit tickets and things. But as you start to see things, read things, and get a little more confidence, don't be scared to kind of go outside the box and try different types of assessments. If something doesn't work, that's fine. If you want to try it again, fix what didn't work and go that way. Teaching is all about learning, not only for the students, but for the teacher. So make sure you try new things. It's not a bad thing to do that. Plus, I think students like it when you mix it up, so you don't have to just do pencil and paper. I'm going to go on a little bit of a rant here, also with traditional type assessments, homework. If you assign homework, I'm not here to poo-poo homework, but what I will say is make sure you always assign homework with a purpose. Make sure that you are actually doing it with the goal of actually having something assessed, reinforced, something. I will never forget this. I worked with someone one time who got on another coworker because they didn't give a whole lot of homework. And I have to admit, I wasn't a big homework giver either. And I asked him, I said, well, why are you getting on them about the homework? And they said, well, she only gives homework if the students need it. And I thought, well, isn't that kind of the whole point of homework? What I'm getting at here is she was just assigning homework so it could be a check for a grade. Like if it was a math teacher, I'm not picking on math. I don't think anyone is a math teacher, but she just assigned things. And of course she wouldn't really even go over it. It was just drill sheets and things like that, which is fine. But I think she was doing it more for check marks and did a homework grade than actually going back over it in class or anything like that. I'm not trying to pick on math or anything, but what I'm just trying to say is make sure you assign homework with a purpose, or it has to have a purpose. Just don't do it to do it. Sorry, that's an aside rant a little bit. But again, just mix it up, avoid bias. Some of your students have different learning styles. Don't always get caught up in asking super high-end questions if you have a mixed classroom. They're important, don't get me wrong. But as you can see here, sometimes, throwing students a bone isn't a bad thing. Follow-up. Make sure after you give an assignment, especially a major assignment, that you go over it with some students. I know some people who don't do this. I've read articles where people don't do this. I think it's very important to go over an assessment. And another thing you have to be willing to do, this was something I always tried to be cognizant of when I was grading. If I have a 10-question essay quiz, and there's one question, we'll say number 4, that 9 out of 12 students can't get. That's probably not the students. That's probably on me. And a lot of teachers have a tough time of admitting that. They just say, well, the students that weren't listening. Sometimes I would go back and I might throw that question out, to be honest, or I might give the students an opportunity to rework that answer. Um, assessment is also something where you're assessing your own teaching, because sometimes if students aren't getting things, there's something in the delivery. It's a hard thing to admit. I had to do it a few times myself, because sometimes, especially when I was probably in my first, second, third year, maybe I wasn't communicating something the way I should. But with that being said, those are some tips for assessment. One thing it's not on this list, like to chime in on just a little bit. It relates to lesson planning a little bit and assessment. Just reading everyone's lesson plans that have been up on Sky, they've been fantastic. But being out in the field and all, I hear this a lot too. I would strongly suggest, if you're using it in a lesson, to include it in a lesson plan. I know you will go out in the field and some teachers will say, well, no one plans like this. Well, that is true to an extent. A lot of people do plan less than what they do when they're students. But I will say this, also a lot of awesome teachers I know have lesson plans that are this thick. I'm not saying you have to be that teacher. What I'm saying is while you are a student at Shepherd University, I would just suggest, if you're doing some sort of assessment that requires a rubric, attach the rubric with your plans. If you have a worksheet that you're using, I would make sure you attach a copy within your plans. If you're going to have students create some sort of assignment where they're sculpting something, I would attach the directions in your plans and the rubrics in your plans. More is better usually with this stuff, because I think you'll find if you plan well and plan in detail, especially early on in your teaching career, it helps with a lot of things. Most importantly, the thing that everyone's always worried about, classroom management. If you are organized and planned and have all your ducks in a row, it just helps so much. Even with assessment, like I say, if you have the rubrics, you have the test, it's just there for you. I'm not saying that when you get into the classroom, you don't streamline things more. You probably will. Most likely you will. But for the time being, I would always suggest, if you think you're going to use it in your plans or you are using it in your plans, include it. That includes assessment, any type of instructional notes, things like that. Just put them in there. It never hurts. With all that being said, that was me on a soapbox a little bit. I will put this article up. Thank you all very much. I don't know if anyone's even watching these, but if you are, I hope you've gained at least one thing out of one of the 3. I will probably, hopefully, should see everyone on Thursday the 16th. Most importantly, I hope everyone stays well and healthy, and I will see you on Zoom on Thursday at 4 o'clock. 4 o'clock. We will not be talking that long. I just want to check in with everyone and make sure we're on the same page. And have a fantastic day.